I will not, in what is a free country, be treated like a criminal. And in our airports today, we citizens are treated like criminals.
Elmer has 2 knee replacements and Madge's hips have been replaced, but they didn't expect scrutinizing pat-downs or to leave the checkpoint missing $300.
I believe that they're cowards. I believe they've got a yellow streak. They're avoiding lawsuits over our constitutional rights.
Making a point. Tonight, we're learning the fate of a Lee County woman caught on tape groping a TSA agent at South Florida International Airport. It made national headlines, and today that woman accused of inappropriately grabbing the TSA agent is found guilty of battery.
Madge was also patted down.
All over my body. I've never been through that pat down before.
Where's my money?
Before going through the detector, Omer says he placed his metal money clip in a bin and kept the cash in his pocket. But a TSA agent told him to put the cash in a bin as well. And after the pat-downs, the money was gone.
I will never stand for a national anthem again. I will turn my back and I will raise a fist the same way Tommy Smith and John Carlos did back in the '68 Olympics. Jesse Ventura will do that today.
You know, the TSA, bear in mind, the TSA has not captured one terrorist. They have not led to the arrest or capture of one terrorist. And this overreach, all of these machinations that they're going through at the airport, this is also uncalled for.
I'm 95 years old. She's 85 years old. What the heck is going on here? Do I look like a terrorist?
While screening a passenger's carry-on bag, TSA agents found the hardware of a .40 caliber gun, a magazine loaded with 2 rounds of ammunition, and a firing pin. TSA agents confiscated the items, but let the man and boy get on their plane.
The officers were comfortable allowing the father and son to continue on their flight. He indicated, though, that he was not aware that they were there. The public was never in any danger.
I was still feeling the effects of the pat-down as I sat in my seat from New Orleans to Houston.
Since its debut in November of 2001, the Transportation Security Administration has headlined corporate media nationwide. However, a topic rarely touched upon is what role corporate interests had in the TSA becoming airport security at all. This part of our history brings us back to the summer of 2001.
I've been on this earth for 37 years. I've never been to a war, but I can only imagine that this is as close as I've ever come.
Pure carnage and complete pandemonium sweep across the streets. The most questionable event occurring long after the bedlam was complete. Over the last decade, many fingers were pointed in many different directions. However, lost in the dust, removed from the biggest crime scene in American history, were none other than the 6 families of corporate media. Though many of these same families shot most of the preceding footage, it's now maintained that the facts reported on that day as it happened were now all wrong, and that coincidence can happen. An examination of the men who broke protocol, the men who deceived fire and police officials, and the men in Building 7. A site for remembrance and unity in Lower Manhattan. A site where many questions were created and over a decade later, never addressed. Posted on many walls and statues, the 4 ominous words, "We will never forget." However, forgetting is exactly what happened. Several years after the attacks in New York, Washington, D.C., and Pennsylvania, millions of Americans, including victims' families, have demanded answers, only to receive an unsatisfactory novel aptly named the 9/11 Commission Report. while others argued as to who was at fault for the slow and uncoordinated military response to 4 hijacked airlines. Others turned a keen eye to an area in World Trade Center Building Number 7 and floor Number 23. A $13 million facility specifically designed for emergencies. What went wrong with the Emergency Management Command Center? To find out, we must meet its tenants and its owners.
Well, there weren't exactly people fleeing themselves off buildings, at least not that we could see today, but there were a near record number of people gathering outside the New York Stock Exchange today to sort of witness history in the making and the opportunity to see incredible drops in the Dow right before their eyes.
We're always told economies are unpredictable, that there is no magic bullet for predicting a local or even global crash. That proved to be untrue several years after the attacks. As early as the 1970s, New York City had been several short steps away from becoming an all-out welfare state.
Here at home, the financial capital of this country has had only a temporary respite from defaulting on its debts. Thinking of the next bill-paying deadline, December 1, New York's Mayor Abe Beame asked Washington for help once more. Would the French disown Paris, he asked? Would the Soviets abandon Moscow? In other words, will Washington abandon New York?
When the good times turned to times of struggle and cutbacks, City Hall began borrowing municipal bonds. Nonetheless, the debt would grow to a staggering $12 billion by 1975.
There can no longer be any doubt that without appropriate federal assistance, there will be a municipal default in New York by the end of the year.
And that prompted questions from skeptical senators as to whether default and a fresh start might not be advantageous.
The city found itself narrowly avoiding credit default. The municipal finance crisis of New York in the 1970s resulted in budget cuts, payroll cuts, that sent many city dwellers packing to the suburbs. This was also the case in the early 1980s. It was then a man in the real estate business began to involve himself in lavish real estate deals. The man was 49-year-old Larry Silverstein of Silverstein Properties. Silverstein began buying and selling many buildings in New York City, including 120 Wall Street and 711 Fifth Avenue, which he later sold to Coca-Cola for $57 million, having bought the building for $11.5 million just 6 years previous. In early 1980, the last undeveloped parcel of the World Trade Center complex was auctioned off from the Port Authority of New York and New Jersey. The winner, Larry Silverstein, and his project, a 47-story office building, which would later house many of the top law enforcement and intelligence agencies in the nation.
He's Larry Silverstein, the president and CEO of Silverstein Properties. His properties have shaped the modern skyline of New York City. He joins us in a strategy session exclusive from the 10th floor of 7 World Trade Center.
Larry Silverstein and his father, Harry, began Silverstein Properties in the late 1950s, taking on a partner, Bernard Mindick. Mindick remained with the Junior Silverstein until 1977, several years before the purchase of the undeveloped parcel, which would later become Building 7. Mindick wanted to buy, while Silverstein wanted to build, eventually dissolving the partnership. Silverstein's let's build attitude continued, even with his largest properties. But one thing the real estate business didn't count on was the stock market crash of 1987.
Good evening, everyone. Well, the law of gravity hit Wall Street today and financial markets around the world, for that matter, as stock prices plunged even more than they did on Black Tuesday of 1929. When the dust settled, the Dow Jones Industrial Average had lost more than 508 points on volume of 604 million shares. That's nearly double the previous record. We have reports on the impact of the crash from New York, London, Washington, and Chicago.
By the early 1990s, the World Trade Center complex began to resemble an empty mini-mall, with its vacancy rates rising drastically. The future of the World Trade Center looked to be a dim one. If occupancy rates continued to drop throughout the complex, it would not only be a massive blow to Silverstein Properties, but one to the city's financial district.
Let's go downtown. It's the early 80s, and you decide that you want to build a building, and you want to deal with the Port Authority, and you decide to build 7 World.
Well, there was an opportunity in 1980 to bid for the site of what was called the Keystone site, owned by the Port Authority. They had built the Twin Towers. They were up and running, and decided in 1980 that they were not going to build yet again. They were going to leave that to the private sector. And so they put this property, the Keystone site, up for bid, and it was a sealed bid. And we decided to enter the bid, and we ended up prevailing. We ended up winning it. And so we went into negotiations with the Port Authority. But as we looked at the site and the floor plans and looked at the marketplace, we came to the realization that the best use of that land was not a 25,000 square foot footprint, but a 45,000, a 47,000, close to 50,000, as much as we could get. I remember at the topping out ceremony, looking up at the Twin Towers, and said to myself, my God, if they ever decide to sell those, wouldn't that be fantastic to own the Twin Towers?
Yes, Larry was living on Easy Street, with hardly a care in the world. Until one winter day in February 1993, when chaos came a little too close for comfort. It appeared as if New York City had been hit by a terrorist attack. Following tips eventually lead to the suspects.
There is some evidence that the FBI may have known of the plot in advance through an informant and might even have stopped the bombing that killed 6 people.
Questionable suspects.
They discussed secretly substituting harmless powder for the explosives, but they didn't, according to the FBI's own informant, Imad Salem.
A nervous governor, an anxious governor.
We'll give you a certain conclusion when we can prove it. Looks like a bomb, it smells like a bomb, it's probably a bomb.
And an investigation that would lead directly to the doorstep of the FBI.
Mort, you heard Assistant FBI Director Skip Brandon say before there was still smoke down in the area, making it difficult to examine what was going on. Is it my imagination, or weren't you down there earlier this afternoon?
Ted, I was down into the garage earlier this afternoon on the first floor of the 3-story garage.
Of everything corporate media learned that cold February day, all was dismissed, forgotten, and tucked away, which would leave the door open for an event that began as beta testing and hasn't yielded since. Three years after the World Trade Center fell victim to an apparent coup d'etat, Mayor Giuliani decided on an Office of Emergency Response, leading to an emergency command center in Silverstein's Building 7, which would later house the Central Intelligence Agency and the Security and Exchange Commission. This $13 million project stood as a station to coordinate emergency response in the event of a disaster, such as a terrorist attack.
From hurricanes and heat waves to bioterrorism, New York City is gearing up for the worst.
CNN reported on television and the New York Times in print the plans and reasons for the Emergency Command Center. It mentions its tight security, no automobiles being able to enter without being searched, and one of its most valuable tenants, the Secret Service.
The new facility is located in downtown Manhattan, across the street from the World Trade Center's Twin Towers. Computers will soon have detailed blueprints of every major building in New York City, as well as evacuation routes. Hurricanes and heat waves would be handled here, as well as terrorist attacks. The command center on the 23rd floor is bulletproof and bomb-resistant, with its own air supply and generators. It's linked to city airports, the Coast Guard, and the Pentagon.
The city is better prepared than it ever has been in its history.
Intelligence officers, terror specialists, bomb squads, top-ranking military officials, all experts, all skilled, and on 9/11, all AWOL. If the attacks on this day were truly an act of war, abandoning the emergency command post during an emergency is an act of cowardice, desertion, cowardice, military crimes once punishable by death. Having 12 employees in 1999 and 72 on 9/11, not one is reported as having remained at their posts in the emergency command center during an emergency. Scanning through various footage, we can now begin to ask questions on the shady characters seen in and around the complex on the day in question. Three men appear quickly but calmly, walking away from the towers, while everyone else in frame is heading towards the complex. The men, who appear to be together, stare straight ahead, not once looking back at the blazing buildings. And passing directly behind as the mystery men cross the street, a car, appearing to belong to federal agents, quickly tails local police. Upon closer examination of this recently released video, the man in front is walking with what appears to be a small black bag clutched in his left hand. The man directly behind him walks casually, clutching a bag of his own. The third man is even more difficult to see because he appears just as the camera pans to the right, looking directly into the lens. A wider angle shows a more complete outline of the man, who appears from behind the telephone pole just before the FBI vehicle passes behind him. Who are these men walking calmly away from the complex during a time of absolute chaos? A black bag, a casual stroll. All the while, the biggest attack in American history unfolds down the street, and the FBI, who are seen later handing out water and talking to victims, make their way to the scene. Completely obsolete when it comes to emergency response, the FBI has little business speeding to the World Trade Center before the towers fell. Unless there was another threat, a threat requiring the assistance received 8 years previous, a bomb. Zooming in and at a freeze frame, we can determine the first 3 letters of this street name. The only street name matching those letters in the vicinity is Vesey Street. Tracing the path the men are traveling, we can track their steps backwards. Before the collapse of the South Tower, 3 men are traced directly to the doorstep of One World Trade. Further confirmation comes from the North Bridge, seen here. An updated look to the actual area the camera was located. Satellite imaging from 2011 shows the exact spot where the men were seen. Now to the FBI vehicle. When following the path of the federal vehicle, we find it headed west on VC Street. We can now trace the vehicle's path as it disappeared from view of the WNYW camera. Before the collapse of the South Tower, the federal vehicle is traced directly past the doorstep of Building 7. During the attack, 3 men were caught in Building 7, escaping shortly after.
What was it like for you? You were inside there as well.
It was pandemonium. I mean, it was something like out of a Bruce Willis Die Hard movie.
You just destroyed a building.
He was there and he was crying, and there was another gentleman crying and for help.
As I arrived there were police all in the lobby. They showed me the way to the elevator. We got up to the 23rd floor. Me and Mr. Hess, who I didn't know was Mr. Hess at the time, we got to the 23rd floor. We couldn't get in. We had to go back down. Then security and police took us to the freight elevators, where they took us back up, and we did get in. Upon arriving into the OEM EOC, we noticed that everybody was gone. I saw coffee that was on a desk. Still, the smoke was still coming off the coffee. I saw half-eaten sandwiches. And only me, Mr. Hess, was up there.
And when we got exactly to 6, all of a sudden, at the same instant, 5 different things happened. The first was the lights went out. The emergency lights went out. Second, the stairwell filled up with a tremendous amount of smoke and dirt and soot, much more than it had been before. The third thing was the sprinklers went on. We were in the dark, no emergency lights, and the water was pouring down on top of us. At the same instant, and the last 2 things were the scariest, the building began to shake. And it was as if you were in an earthquake. And then the last thing was the stairway ran into a wall. All of a sudden, as you were going down on the 6th floor, you hit a wall. So there I am, and I'm saying, what the heck is happening? And I look out the window, and number one, this ash is flying around, and papers, computer papers are flying around.
Mr. Hess!
Money laundering is sleight of hand. It's a magic trick for wealth creation. And it's the lifeblood of drug traffickers.
The Sink, which describes the 9/11 experience of one U.S. Customs agent. Special Agent in Charge Joe Weber of U.S. Customs was at a staff meeting in Building 6 at 8:45 when the first plane hit the North Tower. He then ordered everybody to reassemble at 7 World Trade in the emergency command post. By the time they arrived at 7 World Trade, there was debris and panic and confusion raining down all over the block. The doors to the command posts were locked. If locked doors on the emergency headquarters during an emergency sounds suspicious, the fact that bombs were heard by witnesses going off in the building before and after the Twin Towers collapsed only adds to the mix. Mayor Giuliani is told of the attack while having breakfast on 55th Street in Manhattan. He and Police Commissioner Carrick go to Barclay Street and later state the command center was not safe due to its proximity to the attack, staying at a fire station command post on West Street. Richard Shearer, the director of the OEM, was at a meeting at New York City Hall when news of the attack reached him. He too neglected to visit the command center and instead met with the mayor on Barclay along with Commissioner Carrick. It seemed the most important people in charge were doing everything they could to avoid the most helpful facility built for such an event. 3 of the top officials never arriving and even abandoning their posts, while dozens of firefighters, police, and other emergency response risked their lives going into buildings actually hit by airplanes. These public officials refused to go into a building that had not been hit by anything at that time, giving 2 separate excuses, the first of which the building was too close to the impact site, the second being they couldn't get in, both of which were shown to be untrue. But first, we move forward several years after the attack. FDNY responders' families came out against Mayor Giuliani, suggesting that when it came to 9/11, he wasn't a hero, but in fact, just the opposite.
At 9:20 in the morning, 39 minutes before the South Tower fell, the first tower, Rudy ran. He ran like a coward before the towers fell. He took off and ran with all his commissioners who were supposed to be the leaders. OEM was supposed to be in charge down there. They were considered useless and invisible, the Office of Emergency Management. They did nothing. They took off and ran. They got to the safety of a building, Barclay Street, 5 blocks north of where the South Tower fell. That building suffered no structural damage, interior or exterior. The outside of it had dust and debris around it. Rudy was running like all the other citizens of New York were doing that day, running away. He had too many decisions to make. Yeah, the one decision he made was which direction he was going to run, and he ran north, and that's all he did. He ran. TV made him a hero. He got on TV and said, America, stay calm, and everything will be all right. We'll pull through this. That's all he did. Nothing else. He didn't prepare us before, during, nor after, and he ran like a coward on 9/11.
On September 11th, 2001, at 9:30, Building 7 is said to be completely evacuated. Customs Agent Joe Weber stated the command center on the 23rd floor was locked. Jennings and Hess stay for a moment, notice no one is there, and then leave. But how could one know the whole building was completely empty? The same building that housed various powerful agencies being evacuated by local NYPD and FDNY seems highly unlikely, especially when FBI agents are seen conducting search and rescue immediately following the event. Clearly, these men were in no mood and had little patience when it came to dealing with local authorities. The question now is, what exactly were the men in Building 7 commanding? "47 stories of reinforced concrete and steel crumbled to the ground in under 7 seconds. While most of the attention was fixed on the mass loss of life from the 2 towers, Building 7 was said to have been evacuated shortly after the first plane struck the North Tower.
That building had been evacuated when the collapse occurred.
This was known as Building 7 at the World Trade Center, and that is fresh video you're looking at of that coming down.
Now, again, they were able to get everybody out of that building before it collapsed. So I don't know whether it was accomplished by demolition experts or whether it just happened as a consequence of what occurred earlier.
Seeing the operation facility 2 years previous gives us some clue on how it appeared inside on the day in question. Various equipment you'd expect to see in an episode of 24. What remains a mystery is what happened between the tales of 5 men who came to the doorstep of the OEM between 8:46 and 9:30 a.m. OEM Commissioner John Odermatt stated that when he left, only 2 staffers were there. Why did the 2 staffers leave? And who occupied the facility after 9:30 a.m.? Fires rage in a building not struck by an airplane for approximately 8 hours, reduces the building to dust. One character seemingly lost in the dust. Larry Silverstein reappears in April 2004 to claim his insurance, specifically protecting against acts of terrorism. And with a classic lawyer trick and an attempt to get more funds than the $3.25 billion put in by the real estate company, Silverstein Properties stated on the basis that 2 separate airplane strikes into 2 separate buildings constituted 2 occurrences within the means of the policies, a sort of double indemnity for real estate. However, the insurance company disagreed, and Silverstein Properties was only rewarded $4.5 billion to rebuild. And that's where Silverstein's story ends.
7 World Trade Center has already fallen down, one of the buildings that has collapsed. It houses OEM, several federal agencies.
When Governor Pataki favored privatization of the World Trade Center in 1995, according to the New York Times, he opened up the complex to the most cunning criminals in the Big Apple, with offices 12% vacant. Mayor Giuliani creates the OEM in 1996 and neglects it during an emergency. And on the evening of September 11th, then Police Commissioner, now convicted felon, Bernard Carrick, said this.
Our primary concern as far as evidence goes is the black box, the data recorders. May be some material things that's related to the hijackers. In fact, the passport for one of the hijackers was found some 3 or 4 blocks away.
Don Dano down here. I'm 4 blocks north of the World Trade Center. The second building that was hit by the plane has just completely collapsed. The entire building has just collapsed, as if a demolition team set off. When you see the old demolitions of these old buildings, it folded down on itself, and it is not there anymore.
All I can attest to is that by noon or 1 o'clock, they told us we had to move from that triage site up to Pace University, a little further away, because Building 7 was going to come down or being brought down.
Did they actually use the word brought down, and who was it that was telling you this?
The fire department, and they did use the word, we're going to have to bring it down.
They said, hey, you know, like, you got to stay behind this line because they're thinking about taking this building down. They're not sure if it's stable or not. So they were holding a line off because they had knowledge that something was going to happen. Well, you know, they pushed us back a little bit. About 15 minutes later, actually, like a couple minutes later, they started calming down. They let the border through. People started coming back out into the street. We watched like 5 New York City buses jam-packed with people wanting to do search and rescue head down there towards Building 7. People walked out into the middle of the street to see these people off, like bon voyage. And right then, Building 7 came down, and it was a stampede.
When we find something, like, for example, the Kennedy assassination or 9/11, and there are unanswered questions, there are explanations that are not completely satisfying, and so we look and we find this compelling and interesting story that's made up from bits and pieces of information that appears to give a much better answer. And if we chuck critical thinking out the window, we can not only accept that answer, but be satisfied that we've accepted the correct answer.
When it comes to 9/11, confirmation bias is king. If the truth is never known about what occurred on that late summer day in 2001, the lie will continue to grow as a cancer on not only the United States, but the world. A bill passed in October of 2001, aptly named the Patriot Act, passes shortly after 5 a.m. as politicians are told to vote for it without bothering to read it. An expansion of government ensues with the creation of the Department of Homeland Security 1 year later in November of 2002. And finally, the rise of TSA power. No longer restricted to the airports, an unappointed addition to the people chosen to assault men, women, and children sexually.
I'm aware that there's still some who would question or even justify the offense of 9/11. But let us be clear. Al-Qaeda killed nearly 3,000 people on that day.
You hear this stuff, and it just makes you sick to your stomach. There is absolutely no evidence that anybody other than Al-Qaeda was involved with this attack. How upsetting is this to you?
Look, we've been kicked around for 2,000 years. The face you're looking at's got a lot of anger in it because of that.
The judgment is coalescing around the president that it was Osama bin Laden. I know we live in a country where we're often told that the first thing that comes to your mind, put it down, put the little mark in there. I feel slightly uncomfortable because I spent so many years wondering how the myth of Osama bin Laden got started. We have the Osama bin Laden who was the great war hero. In Afghanistan, we have Osama bin Laden who was trained by CIA, funded and supported by CIA during 3 years of war. I was there at the same time bin Laden was there. He was not the great warrior that went and fought the Soviet Union to a standstill. CIA had nothing to do with him. I think that mythological Osama bin Laden, never mind that he's an absolutely evil man, but the mythological Osama bin Laden causes me trouble, and I think maybe there is another answer out there. I'm not certain that I know what it is.
Blindly trusting any government, any outlet, any politician, any officer, anything capable of deception is a common human weakness. The weakness that allows Americans to tolerate public molestation, creation directly from the minds of the men who've obtained complete control.
Syria's information minister now claims the U.S. and al-Qaeda are working together to overthrow the Syrian government. He made the unusual charge on the day Syrians mourn the deaths of 55 people killed this week in a pair of suicide bombings in Damascus.
Remember the story of the men in Building 7, home of perhaps the biggest scandal of all times.
Keep your eye on that building. It'll be coming down. The building is about to blow up. Move it back. All right, guys.
One of which will never be permitted to know the full story of.
It's about to blow up.